She's not even wearing a uniform. The voice of Lieutenant Commander Wallace, sharp and laced with indignation, cut through the tense hum of the Naval Wargaming Center. The crowd of anxious-looking officers and technicians, already on edge from the catastrophic failure unfolding on the main tactical screen, shifted uncomfortably. A few offered weak, sycophantic chuckles in Wallace's direction. They laughed. She, the target of his scorn, offered no reaction. Her calm was a planet, and his anger was a tiny, insignificant meteor burning up in its atmosphere. She stood near the periphery of the command pit, a ghost in faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple, unadorned ponytail. She looked less like a high-level consultant and more like a graduate student who had wandered into the wrong building. But when Admiral Vance, observing from the shadowed gallery above, saw the precise, economical way she canted her head, her eyes not just watching the screen, but dissecting the flow of data with an unnerving stillness, he felt a flicker of something ancient and profound. He felt the presence of a master. If you believe that true authority is proven, not proclaimed, type competence below. The room itself was a cathedral of manufactured crisis, a cavern of glowing screens and humming servers dedicated to predicting the future of naval warfare. On the immense central display, a battle simulation codenamed Cerberus Sentinel was going horribly wrong. Dozens of blue icons, representing a U.S. carrier strike group, were blinking out one by one, turning a blood red that signaled their simulated destruction. The enemy, a near-peer adversary designated Red 4, was executing a complex, multi-domain attack with a level of coordination the simulation's architects had deemed a low-probability worst-case scenario. It was a digital Pearl Harbor, and the mood in the room was thick with a metallic taste of failure. Lieutenant Commander Wallace, as the exercise director, was feeling the pressure. He was a man built from the regulation book outwards. His uniform was impeccably starched, his posture rigid, his entire being a testament to the comforting certainty of protocol. The arrival of this unknown, ununiformed woman, summoned by a cryptic directive from Fleet Command, was a violation of that certainty. It was an anomaly in his ordered world, and he reacted to it with the only tool he truly possessed: loud, public condescension. She, meanwhile, continued her silent assessment. Her name was Eris Thorne, though no one in the room knew it. Her hands were clasped loosely behind her back, a posture of relaxed observation that seemed utterly incongruous with the blaring alarms and the panic crosstalk of the simulation operators. Her gaze was analytical, sweeping across the cascading lines of code on a secondary monitor, her mind processing the enemy's strategy, identifying the core logic of its attack pattern. She saw the flaw, the elegant, brutal, and almost invisible vulnerability in the Red 4 AI's doctrine. It was a flaw she herself had coded into it years ago, a deliberate backdoor, a ghost in the machine known only to its creator. She was not here to offer advice. She was here to put down her own creation. Wallace, mistaking her silence for intimidation and her simple attire for incompetence, strode towards her, his polished shoes clicking loudly on the raised flooring. He was a creature of noise and surface, and her quiet depth was an affront to him. "I don't know who you are or what think tank you crawled out of," Wallace continued, his voice rising, ensuring everyone could hear his performance of authority. "But this is a secured military facility with a strict dress code. Your presence here is a breach of protocol and, frankly, an insult to the men and women in this room who were the cloth of their nation." He gestured vaguely at the assembled personnel, casting himself as their defender. Eris Thorne's eyes did not leave the tactical display. The primary carrier, the USS Saratoga, was now bracketed by a swarm of incoming hypersonic missiles. Its defensive systems were overwhelmed. A countdown timer in the corner of the screen showed 12 seconds to simulated impact. Wallace took her silence as a challenge. "I'm the director of this exercise, and I'm officially asking you to identify yourself and state your purpose for being in my command center. What is your clearance? Who authorized your entry?" He was practically sneering now, enjoying the public reassertion of his dominance in a situation that was, in reality, spiraling far beyond his control. Her gaze finally shifted from the screen to his face. There was no anger in her eyes, no fear, no emotion at all. It was the calm, dispassionate look of a physician diagnosing a disease. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and produced a simple, featureless black card. It had no name, no photo, no insignia. She held out to him. Wallace scoffed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "What is this? A library card? I need to see a common access card. I need to see orders. I need a justification for this interruption." He refused to even touch the card, leaving her hand suspended in the air between them. From the gallery above, Admiral Vance watched the exchange, his jaw tight. He knew that black card. He hadn't seen one in 20 years, not since a mission so deeply classified that its very name was still a state secret. It was a key, not an ID, a key that unlocked doors even he, a 3-star admiral, could not walk through. Thorne slowly retracted her hand, her expression unchanged. The timer for the Saratoga reached 0. The icon of the carrier flared a brilliant, terrible red and then vanished from the map. A collective groan went through the room. Wallace's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He had just lost his flagship, and he channeled all that failure into his one available target. "Get her out of here," he snapped at a nearby master-at-arms. "Escort this civilian off the premises." Now the master-at-arms, a man who had seen his share of pointless power displays, hesitated, looking from Wallace's furious face to Thorne's unsettling calm, and then, instinctively, up towards the gallery where the Admiral stood, a silent statue in the shadows. He knew better than to move without the old man's signal. Thorne, for her part, simply turned her back on Wallace, her attention once again fully captured by the unfolding disaster on the screen. The message was clear. His tantrum was irrelevant noise. The problem was the only thing that mattered. The situation was deteriorating exponentially. With the carrier gone, the remaining ships in the strike group lost their central command and control hub. Their defensive network fractured. The Red 4 AI, sensing the kill, pressed its advantage with ruthless, machine-like efficiency. A wave of submarine-launched torpedoes was now racing towards the fleet's cruiser escort, while stealth bombers, previously undetected, began their attack runs on the destroyers. It was a massacre. The panicked chatter of the operators filled the air, a frantic symphony of defeat. Aegis system offline on the Princeton. We've lost satellite uplink. Multiple torpedo impacts on the Vela Gulf. She's gone. Lieutenant Commander Wallace stood frozen, his face pale. The intricate war plan he had spent months developing had been torn apart in under 10 minutes. His authority, which he had so loudly performed moments before, was now exposed as a hollow shell. He was a man watching his career burn on a 50-foot screen. In the midst of this chaos, Eris Thorne took 2 deliberate steps forward, her eyes locked on the primary operator's console at the center of the pit. It was the nerve center of the entire simulation, the god seat from which every asset could be directly controlled. She was about to move towards it when Wallace, jolted out of his stupor by her motion, physically blocked her path. "Don't you dare," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You will not touch anything. This is my exercise." Just then, a calm, amplified voice echoed through the room, cutting through the noise like a blade. It was Admiral Vance, speaking into the gallery microphone. His tone was deceptively mild, but it carried the weight of absolute command. "Commander Wallace." "Stand down." Wallace flinched as if struck. He looked up at the gallery, his mouth opening to protest. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is a civilian." Vance's voice was harder now, leaving no room for argument. "I said stand down. Step away from the console and give Dr. Thorne whatever she requires." The use of her name and the title doctor sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Wallace's face cycled through a series of emotions: confusion, anger, and finally, a dawning humiliation. He had been publicly overruled. With a final, hateful glare at Thorne, he took a stiff step backward, clearing the path. He had lost. Thorne moved past him without a glance. She didn't hurry. Her movements were fluid and economical, devoid of any theatrical urgency. She reached the main console and pulled the operator's chair out, sitting down not with the hesitation of a guest, but with the familiar ease of a master craftsman sitting at their personal workbench. The young operator, a lieutenant with sweat beading on his forehead, started to get up. Thorne raised a hand, a simple, placating gesture. "Stay," she said. It was the first word she had spoken since entering the room. Her voice was quiet, low, and clear. "Just be my hands," the lieutenant nodded, swallowing hard. The room began to quiet down, the frantic chatter replaced by a tense, expectant silence. All eyes were on the unassuming woman in the command chair. She leaned forward, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment. She didn't ask for a situation report. She didn't consult any of the assembled experts. She didn't explain her plan. She simply began to work. Her first commands were baffling to the onlookers. "Isolate the E2 Hawkeye's data link," she said to the operator, her voice a steady rhythm against the background hum. "Route it through the primary ESM array on the destroyer USS Mason. I want a passive-only sensor fusion, focused on Red 4's satellite network." The lieutenant's fingers flew across the keyboard, translating her words into lines of code. Wallace watched, his arms crossed, a skeptical sneer returning to his face. This was esoteric nonsense, a desperate, amateurish move. Passive sensors wouldn't give them a firing solution. But Thorne wasn't looking for a firing solution. She was listening. She was mapping the enemy's nervous system. "Next," she continued, her eyes half closed as if visualizing the entire battle space. "Take our 2 remaining Virginia-class submarines. Send one to sprint at flank speed due north, active sonar pinging on a repeating cycle. It's a decoy. It's going to die. Have the other one dive below the thermal layer, rig for ultra-quiet, and proceed to these coordinates." A string of numbers appeared on the lieutenant's screen. He entered them. On the main display, one of the 2 friendly submarine icons began to move, a loud, obvious target. The other simply vanished, ghosting into the digital depths. "You're sacrificing a billion-dollar asset?" Wallace muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. Thorne ignored him. Her focus was absolute. She was now in a state of flow, a perfect union of operator and system. Her commands came faster now, a cascade of brilliant, unorthodox, and utterly counterintuitive maneuvers. She used a flight of F-18s not to attack, but to create a specific radar signature, a ghost image that mimicked a second Phantom fleet. She ordered the destroyers to shut down their powerful spy-1 radars, effectively blinding themselves, and instead rely solely on the pinpoint data being fed to them from a single hidden Hawkeye. She was taking the most powerful navy in the world and making it go dark, silent, and invisible. The Red 4 AI, designed to counter a conventional American naval doctrine of overwhelming firepower and sensor dominance, was confused. Its logic loops began to falter. It saw the loud, obvious submarine decoy and diverted a disproportionate amount of its resources to hunt it down. It saw the Phantom fleet and retargeted its long-range missiles, sending them screaming into empty ocean. Thorne was not fighting the enemy's strength. She was exploiting its intelligence. She was turning the AI's own rigid, logical perfection against itself. The room was now utterly silent. The stunned operators and officers watched as the tactical situation began to subtly, impossibly shift. The red icons of the incoming missiles began to miss their targets, splashing harmlessly into the sea. The enemy fleet, chasing ghosts, had broken its own tight formation, creating gaps in its defensive screen. And then came the moment of impossible skill. "The second sub," Thorne said, her voice barely a whisper. "Bring it to periscope depth." Now, the vanished blue icon reappeared on the screen, positioned perfectly in the center of the now disorganized Red 4 fleet. It had slipped through their sensor net like a phantom. "Fire solution?" the lieutenant asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "No, torna replayed calmly. Upload the Chimera protocol. Authorization code. Thorne Alpha 0, the lieutenant froze. The Chimera Protocol was a legend, a piece of mythical malware rumored to exist deep within the simulation's core programming. It wasn't a weapon, it was a kill switch. No one in the room had the authorization. No one even knew if it was real. He looked at her, his eyes wide. "Mom." "Do it," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. He typed the command. The system asked for the authorization code. He entered it. For a second, nothing happened. Then, on the main screen, every single red icon, every enemy ship, submarine, and aircraft flashed once, turned a sickly yellow, and then went gray. A single line of text appeared on the screen. Red Force C2 network decapitated. All assets disabled. She hadn't sunk the enemy fleet. She had turned it off. The room was plunged into a silence, so profound it was like a physical weight. The blaring alarms were gone. The panicked voices were gone. All that remained was the low hum of the servers and the sight of that single, victorious blue submarine icon sitting untouched in a sea of dead, gray enemies. Wallace stared, his mouth agape. His mind, so rigidly attached to the concepts of missile trajectories and armor plating, could not process what it had just seen. It wasn't warfare. It was pest control. That's not possible," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. "That's cheating." He looked at Thorn, and for the first time, he felt a sliver of genuine fear. He wasn't looking at a consultant. He was looking at a god. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps descending the metal staircase from the command gallery broke the spell. Every head turned to watch as Admiral Vance made his way down to the command pit floor. He didn't look at the main screen, where the impossible result was still displayed. He didn't look at the stunned faces of the crew. His eyes, filled with a deep, weary respect, were fixed solely on Eris Thorn. He walked past the shell-shocked Lieutenant Commander Wallace as if he were a piece of furniture, stopping directly behind Thorn's chair. She, in turn, was already logging out of the system, her work complete. She pushed the chair back and stood, turning to face him. The two of them stood in the center of the room, the quiet eye of a hurricane of confusion and awe. The Admiral surveyed the faces of his staff, his gaze finally landing on Wallace. "Commander," he said, his voice returning to its normal, calm volume, yet it carried across the silent space like a gunshot. "You were concerned about protocol, about appearances. You saw a woman in civilian clothes, and you made an assumption. Assumptions are the mother of all defeats." He turned to the young lieutenant who had been at the console. "Son, bring up the personnel file for our guest." "Project it on the main screen." The lieutenant hesitated, glancing nervously at Thorn. "Sir, I'm not sure I have the clearance to access her file." Vance's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "Try. Use my command override." "Authorization, Vance Omega-7." The lieutenant nodded, his fingers moving shakily over the keyboard. He entered the Admiral's code. For a moment, the system seemed to struggle, access denial warnings flashing on his local screen. Then, with a final, audible click from the terminal, the file appeared. It was stark, minimalist, and terrifying in its implications. Most of it was just black blocks of redaction, entire paragraphs, and pages obscured by the highest levels of classification. But what was visible was enough to suck the remaining air out of the room. It replaced the tactical map on the 50-foot screen, forcing everyone to confront the reality of the woman who stood among them. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a heavy, suffocating blanket of dawning comprehension. It was a silence born of shock, of embarrassment, and of a profound, paradigm-shifting realignment of reality. The operators and officers, men and women who lived and breathed hierarchy and quantifiable achievement, stared at the projected file, their minds struggling to reconcile the unassuming woman before them with the impossible list of credentials glowing on the wall. They were looking at a living myth. The file was a litany of secrets. Name, Thorn Eris. A single, stark line. Below it, title, Director, Asymmetrical Warfare Group. Then another, more cryptic designation, Lead Architect, Project Chimera. Clearance level was a string of characters that meant nothing to most, but to the Admiral and a few senior intelligence officers, it was the stuff of legend, onyx labyrinth/eyes only. It was a level of access so high it was rumored to be reserved for a handful of individuals who designed the very framework of national security strategy. Below there was a section titled Service History. It contained no dates, no locations, just a series of unit crests so obscure they looked like hieroglyphs from a forgotten language. There were no medals listed in the conventional sense, no Purple Hearts or Silver Stars. Instead, there is a single entry under awards, the National Security Medal with Golden Palm, an honor so rare it had been awarded only a handful of times in secret, directly by the president for actions that had fundamentally altered the course of global security. But it was the final line, nestled at the very bottom of the visible text, that landed like a physical blow. It read, Technical Proficiency, Chief Systems Architect and Lead Adversarial AI Programmer for the Manticore Combat Simulation Ecosystem, versions 10 through 75 current. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. Wallace stumbled back a half step, his hand coming up to grip a console for support. His face was ashen. The full, crushing weight of his arrogance came crashing down on him. He hadn't been insulting a random consultant. He had been lecturing the creator of the very universe in which he operated. He had stood on the shores of the ocean and proudly explained the concept of wet to Poseidon. Thorne hadn't just beaten the simulation. She had been debugging her own code. Admiral Vance let the silence hang for a long moment, allowing the lesson to sear itself into the memory of every person present. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an immense authority. Commander Wallace, he began, his eyes boring into the disgraced officer. You are concerned with uniforms. Dr. Thorne doesn't need a uniform for a very simple reason. The regulations you so righteously cherish were written to manage sailors and officers. Dr. Thorne writes the doctrines that admirals follow. Her authority isn't granted by a piece of cloth on her shoulder. It's embedded in the source code of the very systems we use to defend this nation. For the record, Commander, Vance's voice dropped, becoming almost a reverent whisper. In this room, on this subject, she outranks us all. With that, the Admiral turned to face Dr. Thorne. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. In a gesture that stunned the entire command staff, he executed a slow, perfect, formal salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture between colleagues. It was the deep, profound acknowledgement of a warrior to a grandmaster, a tribute from a king to an emperor. Eris Thorne met his gaze and gave a simple, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the acknowledgement that was needed between them. The message was sent. The lesson was delivered. Dr. Eris Thorne did not linger to receive apologies or bask in the stunned admiration of the room. Her work was done. The problem was solved. The noise and emotion that followed were irrelevant to her. While Admiral Vance was still holding his salute, she turned, collected a small, worn leather satchel from the floor where she'd left it, and walked towards the exit. She moved with the same quiet, unhurried pace she'd had when she arrived. The crowd of officers parted for her like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and shame. No one spoke a word. The only sound was the soft whisper of her footsteps on the raised floor. She disappeared through the heavy security door without a backward glance, leaving behind a room full of people whose understanding of power and competence had been permanently and irrevocably altered. The legend of what happened that day in the Wargaming Center began to spread before the door had even finished hissing shut. It didn't move through official channels. It propagated through the human network that underpins any large institution. The gossip over coffee in the mess, the hushed conversations in the barracks, the encrypted messages between trusted colleagues on different bases. It became known by various names: the Chimera Purge, Wallace's Folly, or most commonly, the Day of the Gray T-Shirt. The story was a perfect military parable, containing all the essential elements: hubris, humility, and the shocking revelation of hidden mastery. Young ensigns used it as a cautionary tale about respecting civilian experts. Grizzled Master Chiefs told it to new recruits to illustrate that the most dangerous weapon in a room isn't always the one that goes bang. The story became a piece of institutional folklore, a modern myth to be passed down. It was a story about a ghost, a quiet professional who emerged from the shadows to save the day and then vanished just as quickly, leaving only a lesson in her wake. And what of Lieutenant Commander Wallace? He was not officially reprimanded. Admiral Vance knew that public disgrace was a far more potent and lasting punishment than a negative entry in a fitness report. For days, Wallace walked the halls of the base like a man in a trance. The swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, introspective quiet. He saw her face, her calm, analytical, emotionless eyes. Every time he closed his own, he replayed his own arrogant, condescending words over and over in his mind. Each repetition a fresh wave of mortification. But Wallace, for all his flaws, was not a broken man. He was a man who had been given a profound, if brutal, gift, the gift of true humility. He began to change. The transformation was not sudden, but gradual. He started listening more in meetings. He sought out the opinions of junior officers and non-commissioned officers, asking them what they saw on the ground, valuing their perspective over his own assumptions. He stopped using regulations as a bludgeon and started seeing them as a framework, one that could and should be questioned when it no longer served the mission. He became obsessed with understanding the systems he operated, not just the procedures for operating them. He spent his evenings not at the officers' club, but in the base library, reading technical manuals and strategic doctrine, trying, in his own way, to get a glimpse of the world as seen through the eyes of Eris Thorne. The tangible evidence of the event soon followed, cementing its place in the base's history. A few days after the incident, a technician quietly printed the final screen of the Cerberus Sentinel simulation, the one showing the single, victorious submarine surrounded by the graveyard of the disabled Red 4 fleet. Someone framed it and hung it on the wall of the command center, right next to the portraits of decorated admirals. There was no caption, no explanation. None was needed. It became a silent monument, a constant reminder. Everyone who saw it knew what it meant. Competence is the only rank that truly matters. A few weeks later, a new mandatory training module appeared in the curriculum for all wargaming operators. It was called the Thorn Gambit, and it detailed the unorthodox, minimalist strategy she had employed. It taught operators how to think asymmetrically, how to use deception and silence as weapons, how to turn enemies' strengths into crippling weaknesses. Her ghost was now a teacher, her methods codified into official doctrine. The most significant change, however, occurred in private. Lieutenant Commander Wallace sat down one evening and wrote a letter. It was a long, difficult letter, filled with words of profound apology and newfound respect. He didn't make excuses for his behavior. He owned his arrogance, his prejudice, his spectacular failure of judgment. He addressed it simply to Dr. A. Thorne, care of a classified P.O. box number he'd gotten from the Admiral's aide. He knew he would never receive a reply. He didn't even know if she would ever see it. But the act of writing, it was his penance. He sealed the envelope and sent it off, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He had closed the loop. He had acknowledged his mistake, not just to himself, but to the universe. He had, in his own way, learned the lesson she had come to teach. Dr. Eris Thorne never returned to the base. She remained a whisper, a name attached to an impossible event. Her quiet professionalism had done more to reshape the culture of that command than a dozen admirals and 1,000 new regulations ever could. She had held up a mirror, and in doing so, had forced an entire institution to see its own reflection, its own flaws, and its own potential for growth. She hadn't just won a simulation. She had planted a seed. A year passed. The command center was filled with a new class of bright-faced, eager young officers, ready for their first major fleet simulation. They stood in the pit, looking up at the main screen, their chatter a mixture of nervous energy and professional pride. At the center of the room, standing before the primary console, was the exercise director. He was older now, his face etched with a quiet seriousness they respected. It was Captain Wallace. He had been promoted, not in spite of his public failure, but because of what he had learned from it. Admiral Vance had seen his transformation and recognized that a humbled man with a powerful lesson to share was infinitely more valuable than a prideful one who had never been tested. Wallace waited for the room to fall silent. He looked at the faces of the young officers, seeing his own past arrogance reflected in their confident eyes. He cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I want to tell you a story about this room." He told them everything. He told them about the Cerberus Sentinel exercise, about the catastrophic failure, and about the arrival of an unassuming woman in a gray t-shirt. He told them of his own prejudice, his own loud, ignorant assumptions. He didn't spare himself. He painted his own portrait as the fool, the obstacle. He recounted every condescending word he had spoken. Then he described what she had done. He explained the impossible strategy, the sacrifice of the submarine, the ghost fleet, and the final, silent takedown with the Chimera Protocol. As he spoke, he pointed to the framed printout on the wall. "That," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that captivated the young officers, "is a monument. It is not a monument to a victory in a simulation. It is a monument to competence. It is a monument to the power of quiet professionalism." He let his gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. "You will all face tests in your careers. You will be placed in situations where everything is on the fire and the pressure is immense. But I promise you, your greatest enemy will not be the one on that screen. Your greatest enemy is your own ego. It is the assumptions you make based on what you see, the judgments you pass on people who don't fit your preconceived notions of what power or authority looks like. The most important lesson you will ever learn is this: the most dangerous person in the room is almost always the one you notice the least. Remember that. Remember the woman in the gray t-shirt." He finished his speech, and the room was silent, the young officers looking at him with a new understanding. The story had been passed on. The seed planted a year ago had grown. The legacy of Eris Thorne was now a permanent part of the institution's DNA. True legacy isn't a statue in a park or a name carved on a building. It is not a story of what you leave behind, but a testament to what continues forward because of you. Eris Thorne's legacy was not in the classified files that bore her name or in the secret medals she had earned. It was in the mind of a changed captain who now taught humility instead of hubris. It was in the quiet respect a new generation of officers would show to the civilian analysts and technical experts they worked alongside. It was in 1,000 small moments where an assumption would be questioned, where a quiet voice would be listened to, where competence would be valued over presentation. Her single, silent demonstration had created a ripple effect, a cultural antibody against the disease of arrogance that can cripple even the most powerful organizations. The world is full of quiet professionals, the hidden architects and silent guardians who operate in the background. They're the software engineers who write the code that runs our world, the unassuming researchers who find the cures, the steadfast logisticians who supply the armies, the patient teachers who build the future one mind at a time. They do not seek the spotlight. They do not demand recognition. Their reward is simply the work itself, the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, a system perfected, a mission accomplished. They prove their worth not with their words, but with their work. They're the foundation upon which everything else is built, and their silence is not an absence of strength, but the very source of it. They're the ones who, when the moment of crisis arrives, step out of the shadows and remind us all that what you are is infinitely more important than what you appear to be. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent discipline defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.